I am Ryan McKnight.
I'm Cara Santa Maria.
I am Christopher Smith.
Hi, I'm Andrew Torres.
This is Naked Mormonism,
the serial Mormon history podcast. Welcome to a very special edition of the Naked Mormonism podcast. We are actually going to do part one of a two-part discussion that I had with Christopher C. Smith, a Mormon historian at MHA this past week while I was there. We discussed quite a few things, but the general focus of the subject of these two parts is going to be Mormon and Native relations. From spanning the entirety of Joseph Smith's career and then getting into the early Utah era under Brigham Young. This is a fascinating subject, and it also forms the focus of what Christopher Smith did as his doctoral dissertation. Of course, you can go back and listen to Special Edition episode 38, where he had him on to talk about the Mormon conquest in Utah. So what you can expect on this episode, he and I begin discussing the Book of Mormon and how it's written explicitly to the natives, and we use that as a jump-off point to describe Joseph's mindset in allying with the Native Americans in order to overthrow the U.S. government. How did Joseph Smith accomplish that? Well, he formed his Council of 50, and then we use that to jump into a number of important emissaries that Joseph Smith called in order to create these trading and these military alliances with various native tribes. We focus on a guy named Denna, Jonathan Dunham, and also Alpheus Cutler very briefly. So that kind of forms the preface of how all of this part one of the episode is going to go. Of course, next week we're going to do part two, so be sure to stay tuned for that. So without further ado, also one more preface. I messed up on the audio recording, so I have done my best, and the audio editor, Brian, has done his best to level out the audio and make it sound tolerable, but I do have to apologize to all of you listeners who happen to be audiophiles out there. You're going to notice some artifacts and some points in the audio recording that we just can't really do anything with. And, there's a bit of a volume disparity and whatnot. So my apologies for overlooking that and making that mistake. But that mistake does carry through both parts of these. So once again, without further ado, we'll kick over to the interview with Christopher C. Smith. On episode 147, it's titled First They Came, something happened that was just apropos of nothing. Some Potawatomi chiefs made their way into Nauvoo to meet with the prophet Joseph Smith at a time when it was very chaotic in Nauvoo, July of 1843. Well, when taken just with no context whatsoever, this quote is, it's very odd, and he meets with them, talks with them about the Holy Spirit and whatnot. But if we try to view this within the larger context of Mormon and Native relations, it definitely begins to come into focus, especially as we consider Joseph Smith's militarism and his view of expanding his Mormon theocracy, or theodemocracy, as I think the term was used. So joining us for a discussion on this subject is Christopher C. Smith. Some of you may remember him from Special Edition episode 38, where we discussed his doctoral dissertation on the Mormon conquest in Utah, and he is also a Claremont graduate with a PhD in religious studies and taught for a semester at University of Utah, and now he is an intellectual gun for hire. So Christopher, thank you so much for joining us, man.
Thanks for having me, Bryce.
I'm really looking forward to our discussion today because we're, here on the coattails of MHA, and you and I were discussing a couple of things in the parking lot, as you do at MHA with fellow Mormon history junkies and, professors and, historians. And we were discussing a couple of topics that might make for a good podcast. And you said, hey, this could be a pretty interesting topic of Joseph Smith meeting with various Native American tribes and, him sending emissaries to them in order to help build the Mormon theocracy, the Mormon Empire. And I told you that I've been struggling with how to communicate to the listeners just how much Joseph Smith wanted to be a military dictator. And you said maybe I can help you with that. So I'm hoping you can really help us explore this topic quite a bit, because if we go back to the Book of Mormon, the introduction of it is very clearly read to Christianize the Native Americans and then bring them under the control of the Mormon Empire. And then, hopefully as an end result in the mind of Joseph Smith, use them to turn over the United States government. But there's a lot of steps from converting Native Americans to overthrowing the United States government. And Joseph did take some of those steps. So let's talk about this a little bit. How does this kind of all come to fruition throughout the early history of the church, and especially in Nauvoo?
Yeah, so I like to say that the Mormon church as it was founded was kind of an apocalyptic missionary movement for the conversion of the American Indians. It was the Book of Mormon was written to the Indians. If you look at the title page of the Book of Mormon, it's addressed to the Indians, really primarily, and to the Gentiles almost as an afterthought. And it's got some interesting stuff in it. Mormons like to quote the part in the Book of Mormon where it talks about the Lamanites blossoming like a rose, right? Yeah. They like to think of this as really a restoration of the Indians that's promised in the Book of Mormon, and that element is there. But there's also this interesting, violent element to the Book of Mormon's vision of what's going to happen with American Indians. So I've got a quote here from the Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon says, "Then shall ye, who are a remnant of the house of Jacob," meaning the Indians, "go forth among them," meaning the Gentiles, or white people, "and ye shall be in the midst of them who shall be many, and ye shall be among them as a lion among the beasts of the forest." And as a
it doesn't just sound like intermarriage.
No, they're not. Generally, you don't intermarry between the lions and the beasts of the forest.
Yeah,
and
no.
They don't get along so well. No, so this is not intermarriage. This is violence. It goes on to say, "And as a young lion among the flocks of sheep, and who, if he goeth through, both treadeth down and teareth in pieces, and none can deliver."
That's
so
cool.
Yeah.
So that is a quote that I feel like when people read that in the Book of Mormon, they don't understand the mind of Joseph Smith when he's writing this. It's just it's Book of Mormon stuff, and it's a violent, and there are portions of it that are violent chapters, the war chapters and whatnot. I have a feeling like that glances off of people's backs, but it has some serious implications, and it reveals motivations that played into Joseph Smith's overall, career, his trend.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think most Mormons today don't take this that seriously, in part because it seems implausible today, right? Natives no longer have the kind of military power today that they had at Joseph Smith's time. Even in Joseph Smith's time, it was starting to seem a little bit implausible that the natives could seriously challenge the U.S., but it still could have happened, In, I think, 20 years' time, 30 years' time, this was not plausible anymore.
Right, of course.
But in 1830...
It depends on location, right?
Sure.
Right, because with the ever-expanding frontier, it was just kind of creeping along. It seemed implausible. But when the Mormons, transplanted into, Utah with no frontier to back them up, it seemed, possibly a bit more plausible at that time, I would think.
Yeah, in the 1850s, the natives could still seriously challenge Mormon power in Utah, Right. But by the 1860s, not so much anymore. Okay. So yeah, this is something that I think a lot of people today don't really notice, don't pay much attention to, or if they do pay attention to it, they might have the sense that maybe this is South Americans, that are going to challenge the United States. I've heard that interpretation a couple times from Mormon people who I've raised this issue with. Interesting. South Americans and Mexicans. But yeah, it's definitely not emphasized anymore.
No, it's fallen away. But, yeah. It was kind of a central theme.
It was a very central theme.
During Joseph Smith's career.
Yeah.
It's important to note that if we're viewing it today the way that we currently view it, that's presentist. That is imposing our version of Mormonism on the people who created it. And that's fallacious from the start.
Exactly right, yeah. And in fact, one of the first things that they do after they found the church is that missionaries go west to Indian Territory to convert the Indians.
With, I would say, marginal success, but marginal success implies that there was some level of success. It was a bit of a trial for them, and then they ended up getting kicked out. Right?
Yeah, they got kicked off the reservation because the Indian agents didn't allow unlicensed preachers to come to the Indians for precisely the reason that they might have ideas that might lead to stirring up the Indians or, causing violence or chaos among the Indians. And so the government liked to manage the messages that the Indians were receiving. And I would say this movement vindicates that policy.
I would agree, right? Well, because you can kill a Tecumseh. It's a lot harder to kill a white Tecumseh.
It's true, yeah. And there was a lot of fear of that. I mean, if you read the stuff that government agents said about the Mormons, they were constantly expressing anxiety that the Mormons were going to turn the Indians against other white people. Mm-hmm. And it was something that happened a lot in American history. The British and the Americans in the American Revolution both had Native American allies that they deployed against each other.
Yeah. Same with the War of 1812.
In the War of 1812.
That's during Joseph's lifetime. Exactly.
His grandpa fought in the War of 1812.
Right. A lot of the early Mormons fought in the War of 1812. There's a lot of people who were, associated with it. And similarly with the Black Hawk War, of course, that's a lot closer,
right,
to the Nauvoo period that we're, slowly meandering towards. But it's important to note that it was not just there was not really peace. There were periods of peace that were punctuated by violence and exterminations, and the Indian Removal Act definitely played a part into all of this. It's hard to view the world through that lens because it's a world that doesn't exist to us anymore.
Right,
we live in white America now.
Yeah,
right. The conquest was successful.
Yeah.
The Europeans won.
We haven't had an Indian war in quite some time.
Yeah, it's been a while. About a century now.
Yeah.
So to try and put our minds into that, I think it'd be important to maybe discuss the overt actions that were taken in order to send emissaries to the natives. We start with the first missionary troop headed out to Kaw Township in Missouri. But then, at face value, it doesn't really bear much exploration if we're just doing a high-level review of Mormon history. But nestled in between a lot of these years as the time passes, there are various emissaries sent. And it seems like there were alliances that were attempting to be forged.
Oh, absolutely.
Just kind of hide beneath the surface.
Even that first mission, it's interesting. The Doctrine and Covenants revelation about building the temple, which now reads that they're going to build the temple on the border by the Lamanites.
Right.
Originally had different wording. It said they were going to build the temple among the Lamanites.
Interesting.
So they were planning to go into Indian territory and establish the city of Zion in Indian territory in collaboration with the natives. So, and then when they get kicked off the reservation, of course, that's no longer possible. And so they quietly revise the language of the revelation, and they decide to build their Zion across the river in Missouri, in Jackson County, Missouri. But they still were building their Zion right across the river from Indian territory.
Right.
And that was the principal reason for choosing that location, was its proximity to Indian territory.
Yeah.
And the Book of Mormon talks about this sort of thing. It talks about Gentiles being adopted into Israel, and that the New Jerusalem is going to be populated by, this combination of Israelites, meaning the Indians, and adopted Israelites, meaning the Gentiles. Mm-hmm. And it's got some, definitely imperialist language in there where, in addition to being adopted as Indians, they are going to have a claim on the Indians' land. So they will inherit the land along with the Lamanites. But it's interesting, the Gentiles are not included in that. So if you're a non-Mormon white person, you don't get to inherit the land.
Yeah, where is there a place for you?
There is no place for you in America.
No.
Yeah, so unless you're an adopted Israelite, meaning a Mormon, you don't get a claim on the Americas. Yeah.
No. That's interesting. Okay. When we were talking about this over dinner, you told me a couple of people that I needed to look up, and I think I'd like to explore a couple of these because I think they will help us to understand this kind of in the broader context. Let's begin with Alpheus Cutler. Right?
Okay.
Alpheus Cutler, he's somebody who's kind of been Listeners of this podcast, you may have heard me reference him in passing. He's somebody who has just kind of been hanging out under the surface for a long time. But he was a guy that was born in 1784, one of these veterans of the War of 1812. And then he converted to the church in 1833. He's been here all along and has, experienced various leadership positions, worked on the Kirtland Temple, member of the High Council, ordained a high priest, so on and so forth. But he was explicitly declared to be one of these emissaries, one of these people who was sent to raise a native army.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. He's... So after the succession crisis, he comes in a little later. Maybe we should start with some other people, but...
Okay, that's probably a good idea. Actually.
Okay.
Yeah, if we're going to try and do this chronologically.
Yeah, we probably should.
It's a little easier to understand.
But Cutler is kind of the end of the story, and maybe the end of the story helps interpret the beginning. So
that's okay. That's
why don't we...
Teaser.
A little teaser. So after the succession crisis... Cutler initially sides with Brigham Young in the succession crisis. And when Brigham Young takes the Mormons west to Utah, he leaves Cutler in charge of the Indian mission in Kansas and Iowa. And which at that time was Indian Territory. Kansas was Indian Territory.
Right. Well, and that's all a result of the Indian Removal Act and various groups being sent out there.
Right,
In territories
exactly.
instead of where there were states like Missouri and Illinois.
Right. A lot of the Indians who are living in Kansas formerly lived in Iowa or in Illinois, places where the Mormons have interacted with them before. Now these Indians have been pushed down to Kansas. But these are groups that the Mormons have been in contact with for quite some time, and Cutler is carrying on the missions that have already been in progress. And a couple of other people involved, a guy named Lumen Calkins, and the Bird family, and some others who were associated with Cutler's organization. And I've got a quote here from some Council of 50 Minutes.
Oh, okay. Well, and let's just, we haven't gotten to the Council of 50 in our timeline yet, because we're still in late 1843.
You don't know about the Council of 50 yet? Okay.
So I know it just kind of at a high level. Some of the listeners may be aware of it. Can you tell us a little bit about the Council of 50, especially within the purview of Joseph Smith running for president?
Yeah, the Council of 50 was quite simply the kingdom of God on earth. It was the government of the kingdom of God. I like to think of it as kind of a Mormon shadow government of the United States. Yeah. They declared that the United States, that the Constitution was the rotting head of a dead horse, that the government of the United States was infested with lice. Cool. And so they decided that they were going to set up their own government of the kingdom of God, and Joseph Smith was proclaimed king of the kingdom and acknowledged as king. This was the government that was going to take over once the United States was destroyed, as Joseph Smith repeatedly prophesied it would be within just a few years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. This was what was going to rise out of the ashes of the Mormon overthrow of the government.
That's right.
This is what was going to be left in the wake of all of that.
That's right.
Yeah. So the Council of 50 Minutes, this is the most theocratic that Joseph Smith ever attained prior to his death. And I'm kind of the opinion that had Joseph Smith been successful in 10% of his true plans, American history would look a lot different.
It was vastly different, yes.
Okay, so some Council of 50 Minutes. Sorry for a digression.
No, it's good. So the Council of 50 Minutes describe that a union has been formed with 37 Indian nations. And like the states of Greece by Alexander the Great, they have elected Father Cutler Generalissimo of the Confederacy.
Cool. Okay.
And they say Father Cutler's trowel is going to ring on the temple walls in Jackson County in a few days.
Wow.
The remnants of Jacob are going to slay, go through, tear down, break in pieces, and none can deliver. I tell you, it is a great deal closer than anybody thinks. Father Cutler has done a greater work than any man since the days of Jesus Christ.
Well, that's quite interesting, isn't it?
It is.
Okay. Earlier in the quote, you said an alliance has been made with 37 tribes?
That's what they're claiming.
Okay.
No.
Well, that's like them claiming that we have 300,000 members worldwide in 1944. Right.
You definitely have to take it with a grain of salt.
Okay, but still, that shows that they were making, if that number is, is somewhat indicative of, if it's, possibly exaggerated or overblown, they had been successful in making these connections.
Absolutely, yeah. And they had been to a great council at Taleacoa in Texas, I believe, where Chief John Ross and the Cherokee were orchestrating efforts to unite the Indians. Mm-hmm. And so this, there was a kind of pan-Indian confederacy in formation. And the Mormons were certainly in communication with that. Now, that confederacy certainly hadn't elected General Cutler, the generalissimo of their confederacy. But Mormons were sort of under the impression that that was something that they could possibly achieve,
Very interesting. Okay, so that's a little bit of a teaser on Alpheus Cutler, and we'll bring it all back around to him. But I think that one of the people who I'd like to explore a little bit is Louis Denna or Louis Dana, because he was a convert.
Right. He was an Oneida Indian.
Okay.
Now, his genealogy is a little bit unclear. So we don't know, was he a full-blood? Was he half-blood? Certainly, his family was more assimilated to American ways than most of the Oneida Indians. Just the fact that he spoke English was fairly unusual for an Oneida Indian. So we have some records about people with the Denna surname, also sometimes spelled Denny. So some different pronunciations of this. But a guy named John Denny had served in the Revolutionary War. Okay. And he owned a fancy tavern on the Oneida Reservation in New York.
Interesting.
And so I'll just read to you a little bit about his tavern. There was a visitor who went to John Denny's house, and he describes what the house looked like. Okay, he says, "We set out early and came to a large good inn belonging to an Oneida Indian who has assumed the name of John Denny. This is a large brick house having 4 good rooms and a spacious passage and staircase on the ground floor. The rooms were not less than 18 feet by 20 feet, lofty and well finished. As I sat in John Denny's house, I was told by an intelligent person of the family that building so good a house and making such improvements had nearly cost him his life by raising to envy and indignation the neighboring chiefs.
Okay.
Under the influence of these unworthy passions, they had called him before one of their council fires and informed him that they had taken his proceedings into consideration and were determined that he should leave the improvements he had made and remove into some other part of the country, and that they'd observed he had become very proud, like the white people, that the house he had built was very unbecoming an Indian, and that he must quit it without further delay. In reply, he told them that he was ready to comply, provided they would pay him for his house.
Okay.
And so they broke up without doing anything at that time. Later, they try to kick him out again, and he gets ready to defend his house, joined by his brother and a couple of white people who were visiting him. And after a sharp contest, the warriors are compelled to fly, being covered with blood and grievously wounded.
Wow.
And he then applies for protection to the government of the United States, abjuring his allegiance to the Oneida Nation and taking oaths of allegiance to the United States. He becomes a citizen of the United States. So that gives you an idea of sort of how wealthy the Denna family was in comparison to the other Oneida Indians, and also just how sort of assimilated they had become.
Let's explore that a little tiny bit, because I think that's an interesting conversation as well, is the interplay between different groups of natives and even people within groups of natives of what to do about European encroachment on their lands. There were different groups who were of the opinion that, if we just learn from their schools, if we just assimilate, if we just become civilized by their metrics, then we're going to be okay. That proved to be not true in almost all cases, but they were of the opinion that that's how it was, because those were the promises that the Europeans were making to them, the European Americans. But then there were the others who were saying that we're abandoning our culture, we're abandoning our tribe, or they're cleansing us, they're destroying our culture, they're destroying our peoples. and the difference of the difference of opinions in tribes, within tribes, and among different tribes was heavily exploited by European Americans in order to create fracturing and division among them, and to keep them from, creating a cohesive rebellion against the American government. So I wonder if we can discuss that a little bit, because it sounds like Denny or Dana or however you pronounce the name, it sounds like what he experienced is a bit of a microcosm of this larger this larger countrywide debate that's going on at the time that is tough to deal with.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And it's interesting. This becomes the sort of principal line along which political divisions are organized in Native communities, right? So among the Oneida, Brothertown, and Stockbridge Indians in New York, this community that Denna came from, the principal sort of political divisions in the community were the Christian party and the pagan party, first of all. So a lot of the Indians would convert to Christianity and leave behind their sort of traditional religious ways. And then a lot of others wanted to hold on to their traditional religious ways, right? So that becomes a major division in this community. And then the other principal division was between the Immigration Party and the Citizens Party. Okay. The Citizens Party being people who wanted to accept the government's offer to break up their reservation and assign lots to individuals so that they could either, buy or sell those lots as they pleased and do with them what they wanted and become citizens of the United States and no longer members of a tribe, right? So they would lose their tribal affiliation, but they would get a plot of land that belonged to them as an individual.
And it wouldn't be within the reservation of that's your spot.
Right.
We're putting tape down in the middle of the floor that you stay over there, but we can go on both sides of the tape.
Right. Traditionally, the land has been held in common by the tribe, by the tribal government, and it's been shared. But if they took this deal, then it would be broken up into individual lots, and the tribe essentially would cease to exist.
Right.
The other option was to emigrate, and the government basically was going to seize their lands in New York and give them a reservation somewhere beyond the Mississippi River.
Right.
In the west
of the Mississippi, that was viewed as that's Indian territory.
Right, exactly.
Until it was no longer.
Right. Yep. Well, and it didn't last very long as Indian territory.
Exactly. And these tribal reservation agreements and treaties, they were you get a couple of years mileage out of them, and that was about it, because it would just take a little bit longer for civilization, the civilized European Americans to expand into those territories, for them to say, yeah, that agreement we signed 10 years ago, no, sorry.
Right.
Your new reservation is another 800 miles away.
Right.
We're going to march you, and half of you are going to die during this march.
Right. So a lot of the groups that get resettled in Iowa, for instance, they're there for 10 years before they're moved again.
Awesome.
So
cool.
Does not last long.
We're great. We're great, aren't we?
Yeah,
Thank
we
God
are.
for Whitey. So Dana, then you discussed, or you talked about the Dana family, or Denny family, however you want to say it. They're fairly wealthy, being Oneida natives, and also, what the Europeans, the contemporaries at the time, would consider civilized, speaking English, trading with Europeans, and owning a tavern, so on and so forth. So this guy, Louis Dana, eventually joins the church.
He does, yeah. And we don't know the exact date when he joins the church. I'm guessing that he joined under the ministry of Jonathan Dunham.
Okay.
Because Jonathan Dunham goes several times to this community, Brothertown, West Stockbridge, and the Oneida Reservation in New York.
Okay.
This is a group of natives who traditionally have lived in the Hudson Valley, Mohegans, who have settled in these communities called Brothertown and Stockbridge in New England, and then they're driven off their land in New England and driven into New York, where they found New Stockbridge and Brothertown, New York. And then within just a few years, they're also going to be removed from New York. But these are communities of Indians that have accepted Christianity, and they've adopted a lot of white ways of life. They've got farms and houses.
The white picket fence.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. They're doing everything that they've been asked to do, and they're still getting kicked off their land all the time.
Okay. Well, and Lewis specifically, he was actually chief of this Oneida group in New York. Is that correct?
Well, he was certainly prominent. The problem is white people use the word chief very freely. First of all, they always want to believe that the person they're talking to is really important, and so they just call them chiefs because it sort of makes them feel important to have relationships with chiefs.
Okay.
Thank
you for putting that in context for me.
But secondly, like chief is a white word, you know.
Exactly.
And natives have traditional ways of organizing themselves along clan systems and so forth. But the government finds that too complicated to deal with.
Right, of course.
And so they really set chiefs up, you know. They pick a person who they feel like they can deal with, and then they give that person a lot of money and goods and stuff in order to make that person a prominent leader of the community.
And eventually they sign an Indian Removal Act.
Exactly, and sign over all the tribal lands.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's basically the U.S. government's MO. So Denna to the extent that Denna was a chief, I would say he was a leader of the Christian Party and the Citizens Party, you know. We don't know that, we don't have, you know, documentation of that, but that seems to be sort of where he's situated in the community, right?
Okay.
And also, simply by virtue of the fact that he can speak English, half-breeds often were, you know, considered chiefs of their communities because they could sort of bridge the cultures between white and native. They spoke English and they spoke the native language. They knew how to do business and law and trade, and, you know, they knew how to interact with the U.S. government.
Right.
And so they end up being sort of the brokers of both trade and treaties in those communities, and therefore they achieve a certain prominence as a result of that, you know.
Okay.
So I think that Denna has that kind of position within this community. Yeah.
Okay, that adds a bit of context. But he, like you said, his exact date of conversion isn't really known, but he just kind of shows up in Nauvoo.
Right.
And then it seems like it seems like Joseph was aware of what he had when Denna joined the church, that this is somebody who could be used as an emissary, or this is somebody who could, you know, bridge, like you said, bridge the cultural gap between the white and the Native American peoples. Right,
and it's kind of ironic because Denna not only gets sent as a missionary to his Oneida people, he also gets sent as a missionary to a bunch of other tribes who have no like cultural relationship with the Oneidas whatsoever. You know, so they recall him from his mission to the Oneidas at one point so that he can go as a Lamanitish translator to the Potawatomis and Saukkophaks, and, you know, he didn't speak their languages.
Right. I mean, if he doesn't speak, you know, we know that Denna is awesome. He can speak English and Native.
Right, exactly.
And Indian. I mean, yeah, it shows the lack of respect and the lack of understanding.
Right.
Of the diversity of these cultures.
Yeah, Mormons truly did not understand that.
Well, and not just Mormons.
Yeah, white people.
That was everybody.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. Very true.
All right. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more then about Denna. And he's sent out as an emissary, as a missionary. And he's even admitted into the Council of 50. Of course, this was after Joseph Smith's death. But It seems like Brigham Young especially understood that this guy could be very useful.
Right. He's very useful, at the very least, as a symbol that this Book of Mormon vision of the natives converting is plausible vision, right?
Right.
Denna marries a white woman. He's ordained as an elder, and then he marries a white woman. And he's described as the first Indian, or the first Lamanite, as they called him, to be admitted to any of the quorums of the church.
Okay.
And also probably the first mixed marriage solemnized in Nauvoo. So the first white and non-white interracial marriage.
Very interesting.
Yeah, which is kind of cool.
Yeah. That's a cool feather to put in his historical cap.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
So, kind of interesting politics with the Oneidas. The Oneidas are in the midst of removal, And the Mormons want to send Denna to the Oneidas in order to get the Oneidas to ally with the Mormons. And so that's where Denna is occupied for much of his time in Nauvoo. Okay. Jonathan Dunham is sent to make similar alliances with other native tribes. There's a guy named Joseph Herring, who's a Mohawk Indian, Mohawk being one of the Iroquois nations. Okay. So again, sort of from the New York area. And Joseph Herring, also known as Negea Jasha, that's his native name. But he takes the name Joseph Herring, again, seems to be kind of an assimilated native to some extent. But he's definitely got some bitterness around the way that his people have been treated. And there's a great source with the minutes of the Nauvoo brass band, okay, where he sort of does a little jig and sings a song about how the United States is going to be destroyed. He seems real happy about that. Okay. But his story is kind of unfortunate. He ends up, his sister is down with the Cherokee, and their sort of war breaks out with the natives, between the natives and the U.S. government. And so he wants the Mormons to help relocate his sister into the Mormon community in order to protect her. And the Mormons promise that they're going to do that. And then for whatever reason, it doesn't happen. And he gets really mad and bitter, and he calls them liars. And apparently he gets drunk and says that he's going to kill Brigham Young. And so Bill Hickman,
that or Port Rockwell.
Yeah. Well, he at some point writes a letter in which he says, if you don't want me here, you should just tell me and I'll leave, and I'll still accept the Mormon elders whenever they come by. So he kind of tries to make amends. But the response to this letter essentially is that Bill Hickman murders him, puts a tomahawk in his head. Cool. So and gives his scalp to Brigham Young, and Brigham Young says, "You probably saved my life, so thank you."
Cool.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
That's, okay. I wonder if you don't mind a bit of a digression here.
Sure.
And after that, I'd like to discuss Jonathan Dunham, because I think that's an enigmatic figure that I don't know anything about, and I'd like to learn a little bit. But brief digression, I find it interesting when we talk in Mormon circles, and particularly believing Mormon circles, when we discuss Utah history and things that Mormons have done that are considered controversial within Mormon circles. And the go-to is always Mountain Meadows Massacre. It's always the thing, and it's atrocious. It was an atrocity. It was. Sure. It was a massacre of 120 men, women, and children. It was disgusting. It was disturbing. But the Mountain Meadows Massacre is a molehill compared to the mountain of native bodies.
Truly.
That decorated the ground that we're currently sitting on right now.
Yeah.
We're recording this in Utah.
Yeah.
I wonder if we can maybe discuss a little bit about that disparity and the value that we as European American settlers tended to place on native life, as opposed to the value that we had on white lives.
Right.
Because Porter Rockwell could stack up, he could fill wells with Native American bodies. Nobody bats an eye. Mm-hmm. He kills, Dakins or, Wilbur Boggs. I mean, he's a prominent politician, right? But he shoots a white person and everybody's up in arms. How do you deal with that? And what do you think that reveals about humanity?
We care about our own and we don't care about other people's. But Bill Hamblin is another one. He's well known as a murderer of apostates, right? People know this about Bill Hamblin, that he was a kind of a gangster. They don't know that in his autobiography, he describes going into Nevada and going on, basically seeing a burned out wagon and deciding, there's Indians around here that are a real problem. And he goes to the nearest Indian group that he can find and just slaughters men, women, and children. And he describes in that narrative, I think, killing 70 individual people, of all genders and ages, and,
Wow. Okay.
without talking to them first to see if they were the ones he was looking for. Just massacres them. And in several different camps, like they wipe out the first camp and they're not satisfied, so they go find another one, I mean, they just, it's an awful, awful narrative. And he describes it with such relish. He's so excited and so proud. It's horrifying. And this is not something that people talk about. I don't think this massacre has a name, which is one of the most disturbing things about it.
Right. We do have names for some of the, the massacres that included hundreds of people. The Bear River, the Timpanogos.
Circleville.
When, hundreds of Native lives were lost.
Yeah.
But we call the Hans Mill scrap, a massacre when it was 17 dead Mormons.
Right. I mean, I would not call Hans Mill a fight, in fairness, because it was an attack by an organized militia on civilians.
Absolutely. And I agree it was a massacre, and it was a strategic disadvantage by the Mormons there. It was a terrible decision.
And they killed children, which is
they killed children.
Not okay.
Yes, we call it a massacre, but that's with 17 people. But here you're talking with Bill Hamblin, upwards of 70 people.
Right.
No name.
Right.
Probably not even location markers where it happened.
Right.
Nevada. Just lost to history. People who were entire tribes of people who are just lost to history, who will never be known about, who will never have their native names, will never have their culture, will never know anything about them, about their children, about their children's children, and
just anonymous.
They're just gone.
Yeah.
They're just lost.
Yeah. It's horrifying.
Okay, so I felt like that was quite relevant, especially within the broader context of everything we're discussing here.
Absolutely.
So let's rerail this back onto Jonathan Dunham. This is a name that you told me about that I'm sure I've run across, but it's just never occurred to me to look into this guy.
Sure. Let's
talk about Jonathan.
Jonathan is kind of a fun guy. He's raised in Rushford, New York. He's a white guy, but interestingly, he later signs one of his letters, J. Dunham Lamanite.
Really?
Yeah, why he was calling himself a Lamanite is not entirely clear. Okay. I looked in his patriarchal blessing to see if maybe he had been assigned to the tribe of Manasseh, because then maybe he would have thought he had native ancestry. But no, he's not assigned to Manasseh. I believe he was Ephraim, so that doesn't explain it. The only thing I can think is that he was either playing Indian, which is something that white people periodically do, or
as a kid, cowboys and Indians.
Yeah, sure, right. And people do it in more serious ways too. But also the other possibility is that at some point he was adopted into one of the native tribes that he visited, because he serves as a missionary to a number of different Indian groups.
Interesting. So that would have been high honors to
would have been
adopted into a tribe. Okay.
Yeah, and several of these people are adopted. I think that the Herring brothers, for instance, were adopted into the Potawatomi tribe at one point.
Okay.
So yeah, this is something that could plausibly have happened when he went to the Potawatomi. He went on at least 5 missionary journeys during his lifetime. We've got about 4 volumes of journals, but he originally wrote 13. So there are big gaps in the narrative of his life. But we do know that he went to the Brothertown, Stockbridge, Oneida communities in New York. And so he may very well have been involved in the conversion of Louis Denna. And it's kind of fun. He describes meeting with some of the Baptist leaders of the Brothertown and Stockbridge communities. And they tell him a myth about a grapevine. So they say that deep in their past, in their community's past, their people were crossing a river, and they stretched a grapevine, or they found a grapevine that was stretched across the river, and they were crossing the river hand over hand, and then the vine broke, and so some of the people got across the river, some of the people didn't, and therefore their tribe was divided, from then on. Okay. Well, this is a myth of the dispersion of the Six Nations of the Iroquois.
Oh.
And so it was an explanation of why some of their group lived in the south and some of their group lived in the north, north of the Ohio River.
Okay.
But Dunham interprets this as a transoceanic crossing.
Does he now?
So he thinks that this is a myth about, their people coming over
really
from...
long grapevine.
Yeah, right. And so he tells them the Book of Mormon myth. He gets really excited that they have a myth about this transoceanic crossing, and he tells them the Book of Mormon myth about transoceanic crossing, and gets what he thinks is an enthusiastic response, So that gives you some impression of the kinds of interactions that Dunham is having. Maybe not like super interested in correctly understanding the culture, more just interested in kind of making connections. Cherry picking. Confirmation bias, definitely.
Okay.
But
and we don't know when he says an enthusiastic reception, we don't know what that actually looked like.
Sure, we do know he baptized a few people.
Cool.
So
good for him.
Yeah. And one of the people he goes to is named Dockstader, and Denna had some Dockstader connections. Okay. His family did, so there was some intermarriage between the two families. So probably, this is how Denna is coming into the church, is by communicating with Dunham.
Interesting.
Yeah, but Dunham is a lot of fun. He writes this letter, which is one of the few. Actually, I think it's the earliest source for Joseph Smith believing that the 10 tribes are on another planet.
Really?
Yeah. So the Bible says the earth rolls on her wings, right? Okay. And so Joseph Smith seems to read this as the idea that the earth used to have attached to the North and South Pole separate spheres, and like wings, right? On the axis of the earth, so that it rolls on its wings.
Interesting.
Yeah. Joseph Smith was a weirdly literalistic interpreter of the Bible sometimes. And so his idea is there's also, there's an ancient text, I forget the name of it right now, that talks about the lost tribes going into the land of the north. Okay. And so Joseph Smith thinks that the lost tribes went to the North Pole and got onto this other sphere that was attached to the North Pole. And then at some point that sphere detached from the earth. And so the lost tribes are flying around on that sphere somewhere. And someday that sphere
is known as Kolob.
Well, I don't know. He doesn't give the name of it. But someday that sphere will return to the earth and reattach to the earth. And of course, the reattachment of a sphere to the earth is going to cause cataclysmic earthquakes and everything, which is the end times. Yeah.
It's the Anunnaki. The giants.
Right. And then the lost tribes will return to our sphere, and that's when they get restored and come from the land of the north and everything.
And Christ will reign personally on the earth.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a very interesting apocalyptic.
Yeah. and there are.
I like it. It's cool.
There are several sources for it, so it seems to be legit. And Dunham is the earliest source. And this letter that. Well, he doesn't actually write the letter. It's written by Thomas Burdick, but Thomas Burdick copies a letter from Dunham into this. So, assuming that Thomas Burdick is accurately reporting what was in Dunham's letter, Dunham endorsed this, and that is the letter that Dunham signs J. Dunham Lamanite. And in the same letter, he basically describes this vision of Indian apocalypse where the Indians are going to wipe out the United States,
So, I mean, a lot of important theological, quirky, definitely, and an important theological detail all wrapped into this one letter.
Right, exactly.
That's an important letter.
Yeah, it's a really important letter, yeah. Without that letter, I don't think we would have a sense of the kind of apocalyptic thinking that Dunham engaged in, because in his diaries, he tells us that he's going to the Indians, but he often doesn't tell us what he's saying to them, he doesn't describe a lot of his interactions with the Indians.
Okay.
And he's not super self-reflective in his diary, so he doesn't sort of give us what he's thinking most of the time. He just tells us sort of where he was and the distances he traveled and things like that. So it's really wonderful to have this letter that gives us a little bit of his worldview.
So then, if you don't mind, have him signing at Lamanite, you said that could just be due to him being adopted into one of these tribes. Could we possibly speculate on that having to do with what he thinks is, the great ultimate goal of the church is to align Mormons and natives, convert natives to Mormonism, therefore become one of these tribes of Israel that are here, to cleanse the Gentiles. And maybe he was just taking the next logical step in that by claiming an Indian Israelite heritage, a Lamanite heritage for himself. Maybe he was just taking the next step.
Yeah, that's one of the ideas that I've toyed with, is that given that the Book of Mormon says that whites are going to be adopted into Israel, maybe he just was thinking that he had been adopted into Israel and therefore he was a Lamanite. I don't really know. I think it would make more sense if he had called himself J. Dunham Nephite, if that's what he's going for,
Okay. But, I mean, his interactions with the Oneida and possibly marrying into...
Right. If he was formally adopted by some tribe, right, then it would make sense for him to call himself J. Dunham Lamanite.
Yeah, because all the Nephites are dead.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Interesting. We still have plenty more to talk about. I want to get into the Herring brothers. I want to bring us into Alpheus Cutler, as well as a little bit more commentary on the purposes of the Council of 50, and maybe a little bit about Joseph Smith's presidential pamphlet and campaign, because I think that is all interrelated into this.
Yeah.
So we still have quite a bit more to get into, and I think we're going to call this good at part 1, because that's a good primer for a lot more that we have to discuss. So I just want to say, Chris, thank you so much for joining us for part 1.
Thank you.
That's going to do it for part 1 of our interview with Christopher Smith. Of course, tune in next week to hear the conclusion, where we really get into kind of the mentality and the motivations and the inclinations of the Mormons, as well as broaching into the Utah era, which is where the relations between Mormons and natives really begins to accelerate. We have some new patrons over at patreon.com/nakedmormonism to thank. Looks like we have new pledge from Michael, from Jeff, who I've shared a bit of interesting Facebook correspondence with, as well as new pledges from Carrie, Stephen, and Clint. So to all of our new patrons, as well as all of our long-running patrons, thank you so much for supporting the show, and of course allowing the resources necessary to attend Mormon History Association, and of course pay historians like Christopher C. Smith the speaking fee for helping me generate the content for the episode that you just listened to. Also wanted to let everybody know, if you are a subscriber over at patreon.com/nakedmormonism, we just had an AMA with Andrew Torres of the Law Offices of P. Andrew Torres and the Opening Arguments podcast. We did a Mormon-specific AMA, so if you are a patron, check your Patreon exclusive feed, or you can find it on the YouTube channel for Naked Mormonism. It was a really interesting discussion, and Andrew, of course, was very generous with his time. We tried to limit it to about an hour, 15 minutes. We try to go anywhere from 70 to 85 minutes. Well, when it comes to Andrew Torres answering questions in a lightning round AMA format, it ended up going about an hour, 45 minutes. So, but still, it's an extremely fascinating conversation. We dive into a couple of aspects of Mormon history, as well as current day politics and Mormonism. And we're going to have him back on in a future episode to discuss legalization of polygamy. That was something we teased at the beginning of the AMA, and unfortunately, we just didn't have time to broach the subject. But both of us had done a little bit of prep work on it, so it is an interesting subject, and to be looking forward to that in the future. Moving forward, for patrons, of course, we release an extra episode every week. Sometimes we're unable to, but by and large, almost every week we have an extra episode that releases on Monday or Tuesday night. We're doing our Name a Book Club. This is where we read through old texts, important texts in Mormonism, and I offer my commentary along with them. We've just finished History of the Saints, John Bennett's book, circa 1842, and we are broaching a brand new book in this. Now, this is a book that I didn't know about, or if I did know about it, it had slipped from my mind, but it was written in 1839 by P-cubed Parley Parker Pratt, and it is titled History of the Late Persecution Inflicted by the State of Missouri upon the Mormons. So this ought to be an interesting book, especially because it was published in 1839, giving Parley Pratt's contemporary take on the Mormon-Missouri War, which ought to be really fascinating. So the first episode of that reading is going to air on the 17th. That's just a few days after this episode comes out. And then the second reading is going to go up on the 24th. And this is going to be a book that we'll be spending a little bit of time on. Granted, the last book we read through is about, just over 350 pages. This one is less than 100, so we're going to get through it a lot faster. But of course, if that's something that you want to listen to, you want to hear along, and listen to my commentary as we read through it, subscribe, throw me $1 a show, and, that helps to perpetuate the show. It helps to get me to conferences to learn about books like this, and it helps provide the funding in order to, keep the show running, keep the lights on over here at Ground Gnome Studios. So with all of the sales pitch out of the way, we're going to go ahead and shut it down for the evening. Thank you all so much for joining us. If you want to get in touch with me, you can do so at nakedmormonism@gmail.com. Facebook, Twitter, social media, all of the places, Naked Mormonism, you can find us there. And of course, if you'd like to help with the visibility and you can't give $1 a show, you can always leave us a 5-star review on iTunes, Stitcher, or your podcasting app of choice. With that, thank you all so much for hitting the download button and sticking around, and I hope to talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast. This podcast is produced with the help of Julie Briscoe as social media manager, Brian Ziegenhagen as audio engineer, and Andrew Torres of the law offices of P. Andrew Torres in the Opening Arguments podcast as legal counsel. Music is written and performed by Jason Camo of aloststateofmind.com and used with permission. Naked Mormonism is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC, copyright 2019, all rights reserved.